Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar about hardware device selection and custom device support with balenaOS. I'm Alan. I'm the Edge AI enablement lead here at Balena, and joining me today is Kenna. Kenna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the device enablement lead, but that may not make a lot of sense. So, in other terms, I am the product manager for the device onboarding experience and for hardware partners or integration partners. And my job is to make sure that that experience is as smooth as possible and to improve it wherever we can.
Excellent. Well, now that you've described yours, I guess I should do the same.
Yeah,
As
you
an,
should.
as an Edge AI enablement lead, I help people get up to speed with examples and documentation for deploying Edge AI at scale on Balena. So hopefully that's a little clearer. um, but I wanted to mention before we get into the topic at hand that we will be providing follow-up materials to attendees. So I know we're going to present a lot of information today, and we will provide a lot of links, and there'll be a lot. So don't worry if you can't keep up with maybe taking notes or copying links. We'll make sure that those are available after the fact. So we'll be sending those out either in a follow-up email. We may also have a blog post to post that will have all the information that you'll see today. So I just wanted to put that out there. And also, if you have questions as we go along, please just submit them, and we will do our best to answer all the questions. If we don't get to all of them, we'll include the questions and the answers in the follow-up material. So, yep, that's the that's the topic of today's webinar. And moving to the next slide, we have a little bit of a summary of what is Balena. There may be a few people joining us who aren't too up to speed on what Balena is. So Kenna, if you want to give us the quick overview of the Balena platform.
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of people know Balena from Balena Etcher, the SD card flashing tool. It's open source. It's free to use. People have been using it for many years. But what a lot of people maybe don't know is that behind the scenes of Etcher, Balena Cloud existed, and Etcher was kind of just a way to facilitate Balena Cloud. The idea behind the platform itself is to allow people to get containers on edge devices. When we first started, it was getting the first Docker container on an ARM device. But now it's to any number of devices, ARM, x86, what have you. And the entire stack is container-based. Even our operating system and all the components that we use are container-based. But you might see other terms like Balena Engine and balenaOS. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about those in the next slide. You might also see Open Balena. That's our open source version of the platform. It's got fewer capabilities in some respects and is not hosted and managed by us, but it's out there and available. So yeah, the key value proposition for Balena is that it's a fully container-based technology stack. So developers who are used to cloud-based technologies can use those on edge or embedded devices, and that allows you to update software the way that you're used to in a CI/CD workflow, and you also get device management. So being able to do over-the-air updates and troubleshooting remotely, and really getting into the console and running the Linux commands that you might need to get to the source of a problem. So a lot of capability there, but these are some of the little logos you might see related to our platform in general. But yeah, and then as far as balenaOS specifically, I kind of wanted to get into this a little bit more because even though for most customers, they never need to know about any of this. This is all the kind of the magic under the hood that Balena does for them. But in regards to custom device support, it might matter because it involves the technologies someone might need to be familiar with in order to work through some of these things. So at the base layer, the way that Balena is able to see the hardware underneath and really map to whatever's available to the OS. We use something called Yocto BSPs. Yocto is a project that allows people to create a custom version of Linux specific to their hardware. And so we have something called Balena, which is a BSP that enables that. And for each individual device, we enable vendors' BSPs. And that allows us to do all the same things across the platform, no matter what hardware you use, but our OS can see everything. And so balenaOS, one thing to be aware of if you ever get into working with it is that it's a read-only file system. That's by design for security reasons. It's stateless. These are all really good things, but they may mean that you interact with balenaOS in ways that you're not as familiar with if you are used to a read-write file system. Um, but you have a lot of things that are familiar to you. So systemd, Crony, Network Manager, Modem Manager, a lot of the Linux subsystems that you're used to are all there. And then the way that we manage containers is the Moby framework. So it was created and open source by Docker, and we took the components of Moby and we kind of stripped out all the things that you don't need for edge devices because it was, meant for cloud or data center type environments, and so we optimized for embedded. So that's kind of the long and short story of how we get containers on specific hardware.
So for running containers on the edge, you don't need to know all of this, but
Yes.
it's very helpful. It's
If
helpful if you're going to get a little deeper into custom device support, but we don't
Yeah,
want to scare
exactly.
anyone about.
Yeah. This is not a scary slide. This is anyone who uses Balena never even has to know what Yocto means. They've never had to worry about Moby. And none of this matters, except to say that there's a lot of things that we do for folks under the hood that makes it a lot easier for them to get started. So people who don't have embedded Linux experience can get started using the tools they're used to and just get off the ground. So.
Right. And we have in our next slides, we have some points also that don't really quite require that information. So we'll
Yeah.
just start from the most basic and move up. But before we get into actually using devices on balenaOS specifically, we wanted to just talk about in general some of the considerations when you're selecting hardware to run at the edge in any size fleet really. But what are some of the things that somebody should think about when they're first starting out for making a hardware decision? Kind of.
Yeah. And I'm speaking pretty generally at a high level, but
Yeah.
from a when most people are getting started, if they haven't done this before or haven't dealt with embedded hardware, that sort of thing, the prototyping stage is usually on something you're familiar with. So a lot of people grab a Raspberry Pi off their desk or a BeagleBone or something else that they've used in university or something, and they just test with it. And the two key things for prototyping are usually availability, because you want to just test something, and if you break it, you want to replace it really quickly. And the other is having all the capabilities you can available to you, so that maybe you start thinking, oh, I want this to have Ethernet, but as you go through it, you realize more of the environments your customers are using are going to be Wi-Fi. So you need to have both of those available to you, so that while you're prototyping, you can just test from one thing to the other. So that's kind of the early stages. But as you continue testing, sometimes in the field, a lot of times people get to 100 devices or something, maybe 1,000 even, before they start really seeing some of the implications of their devices in the field. And so at scale, you start to have these questions about some of the hardware, and some of the ones that Alan and I were kind of trying to think of things that would be the most interesting to talk about that we've run into. There's a lot, but one of them is storage considerations. When I first came to Balena, I thought, oh, for sure, if you are going into the field with an actual production fleet, you're going to want eMMC. You're not going to want an SD card that can crash on you. But interestingly, we found situations where that's just absolutely not the case. Folks with 100,000 or 200,000 devices out there are running on SD cards. And the reason is that in their particular applications, they know that they will run through the eMMC. They will wear it out for certain. And so an SD card replacement is actually the cheaper option than having someone go on site and replace that device, or try and desolder and resolder eMMC. I don't think most people would even bother. You'd probably just swap it. But either way, there are applications like video streaming and, interestingly, blockchain applications where the blockchain is getting written to very frequently. And you're going to replace your storage medium. So an SD card is a lot easier. Um, and then, I mean, we've seen the reverse, of course, too. We have customers where we say, hey, SD cards are going to wear out over time. And they say, yeah, yeah, yeah. But, the cost is so low, it doesn't matter. But then after your entire fleet starts to die and you have 1,000 devices out there and you're replacing SD cards constantly and someone's having to go on site and you're paying for their airfare and their hotel to go on site and replace this thing in the field, uh, the cost of an eMMC suddenly becomes a lot more scalable than the SD cards were. So
Right.
things like that.
And we can mention that balenaOS is optimized in many ways for the edge. So it is optimized for SD card writes
It's true.
to not hammer the SD card if possible, but that's application dependent. So there's just some times where the OS is not going to be able to help. If, for instance, you're running like a massive database on an SD card, then there's only so much the OS can do to minimize that extra writing.
Yeah. Yeah, and logs. If you need to troubleshoot something that's pretty in depth, and you start, generating more logs to understand the problem, you're going to generate more wear on the SD card, and that's just a fact of life. But yeah, another one that we're running into more frequently these days is time management consideration. So a lot of folks don't usually deploy out of the gate with a real-time clock or an RTC. And that makes so much sense because it would cost more, and then it's something you have to potentially manage if that's what you want to do. But when folks get into a position where their devices in the field are going offline for a certain amount of time, you start to run into security implications. So typically, your authentication mechanisms need the time to be accurate within a certain amount, in order for the authentication to actually work. And so suddenly, a real-time clock for those moments when you've gone offline for a significant amount of time start to matter. And so things like that come up as well. Um, but I think the one that Alan is more familiar with even than I am is, this machine learning capable hardware. So there are various libraries out there, and they require different types of hardware or allow you to start thinking through different types that you might want to use. There's cost considerations. There's the connectivity for those peripheral considerations. So for instance, like a TensorFlow application, you might consider just adding a Coral TPU to your Raspberry Pi. But now suddenly you need an extra USB port. Meanwhile, if you're using CUDA libraries, then of course you're going to need NVIDIA GPUs. And so these are all things that you kind of have to test for. And there are different ways to do that, trying to size your hardware. Usually people want to get as much capability as they can for the least amount of dollars. And so that's another thing to start thinking about early on, but also think about how your device is going to be in the field 5 years or 10 years from now, running those same workloads or maybe something higher. So yeah, there's a lot of considerations to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot here to to digest, and this is the general list. And if we move, to our next slide, now we start talking about you've made that high level decision, but now, what hardware do you want to use on balenaOS? So we have a list of compatible devices, and there are many. It's like a list of over, I think, 80 devices that are compatible with balenaOS. But you see here, this says part 1. We have kind of 3 main options when it comes to devices that you can use with balenaOS. So this slide and what we're talking about now is option 1, which is basically off-the-shelf hardware that's readily available and doesn't need any modification. Now, over here, I have a small visual for this. I have 3 devices here that are all based on the Raspberry Pi 4, really. And for this option 1, what we're talking about, thank you, everyone likely familiar with the Raspberry Pi. Um, so this is readily available off the shelf, and for many applications, you might not need to make any modifications to this or add anything extra to get this to do what you need on balenaOS, but it's immediately supported out of the box. And that is our option number one, and one of the items you would find on the list. And as we move through the other options, I'll describe these other boards as well that are, let me get over here, that are also Raspberry Pi based boards. But Ken, if you have more details about this option number one off the shelf.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so checking the compatibility list is the key. We're actually going through some pretty major website overhaul discussions at the moment. So a lot of the documentation for finding compatible hardware or ways to make your hardware compatible is pretty hard to find today, which is part of the reason we're having this webinar. So I wanted to say that first, here's our hardware compatibility list, and I see that Mark's shared it in the chat, which is great. The other thing you'll notice is that more and more we're having manufacturers add the Works with Balena logo. And this is just a quick way to show that, hey, the manufacturer has worked with us to enable this hardware. And that's just a really quick way when you're going through the list of things you need from a manufacturer that shows, hey, this is already compatible. So that's a really nice place to start. But the other thing to note is that even if you have the right device type, let's say you have, I don't know, you've chosen a CompuLab device and everything looks good, but you're adding this additional peripheral that you need for it. You may still need a driver or two to make everything work as expected. And so we have this really nice blog post that one of our OS engineers wrote for out of tree kernel modules. And that's just been linked, and it's a good read. It's quick, but it's just a really helpful way to say, hey, you you may need this, especially for our generic x86. So, for instance, in a lot of the ARM-based devices, we'll have a specific device type that's to a particular piece of hardware. With x86, it's a common BIOS. It's easier to work with one device type, so we do. But that may mean that in our testing, we may have tried, let's say, a NUC 11, and it's got a particular Wi-Fi chipset, but on the hardware you're running, x86, it's a different Wi-Fi chipset. So you may need a driver. And if it's not in the upstream Linux kernel already, then this would be the process you do to test that. And so the idea is that you test the kernel module using this process, and if everything works as expected, then you would submit a pull request or submit a ticket to us to ask for a pull request to be created that adds that driver in. So that way you're always getting it with new host OS updates going forward.
Right. So even with, as I was showing before, even with an off-the-shelf piece of hardware, you still have options to make it even more compatible, even if it's one that you could readily, go into a store and buy.
Yeah.
But now we're going to move into option number two, and I have an example of that as well. So we saw the Raspberry Pi 4 that I had sitting there. And then for those of you not familiar, this is inside this piece of metal is a CM4 IO board with a CM4 module. Oops, it's right there. That's the compute module 4. And that's basically a Raspberry Pi 4 on a board, making it possible to embed this into your own designs. And this carrier board is the official Raspberry Pi CM4 IO board, and this we actually support. And so this is the board that you would use maybe for prototyping. And if you wanted to make your own device, which is really option number 3, but if you're using this device and you modify it, that's what option number 2 is, to make sure that the device boots, but maybe everything doesn't work on it. And can you give us some more details about this option?
Sure. Yeah. So even if you have your drivers installed, sometimes the bootloader may not know that that's the driver that needs to be used by default, especially if you have multiple listed in there. So a lot of times what you'll notice is that the device boots, but not everything's quite working the way you expect, even if all the drivers are present. And a lot of times this means that you're missing a device tree or some other overlay. And so not all of our device types support this. We're working towards a future where they will all support this, but today it's kind of we started enabling it at a certain point, and so some devices have it and some devices don't. But for some devices, especially some NVIDIA Jetson devices, some of the dev kits for IMX8, that sort of thing, you have the ability to add a DTB from the manufacturer into a folder that the bootloader will find. And so you can add that file, select it in the dashboard for the device's configuration, and then kind of like with the kernel module, you'll test it, make sure it works as expected, and if it does, submit a PR to us to get that added going forward, so you always have it when you do a new host OS update. So it's another way to enable hardware that either may not look on the surface like it's supported out of the box, or it says it should be and isn't working correctly. So even though we have 80 device types listed in our compatible hardware, so there's actually a lot more devices that can be supported either by adding these kernel modules or adding a DTB or both. So we just kind of wanted to mention that these are other ways to make sure that all of your hardware, you can test it and at least try and get your hardware working right out of the box, especially with dev kits. A lot of these manufacturers will create something like what Alan was showing, which is just a way to show off their hardware. They have a SOM or whatever module that they're using, and they want you to see all the features of that. So they'll create a developer's kit, and you can test all of the features. But then ultimately, you're going to create something custom with that. So we'll probably enable the dev kit, which means all of the capability they have available to the SOM is available to you. But again, you may need to add a driver or something. So those are some options for folks.
Right. So as you were saying, so this is like the reference carrier board for the
Yeah.
Raspberry Pi CM4, and we do support this. So if you are making a board similar to this, you would use this device type on balenaOS, this Raspberry Pi CM4 I/O board, and then probably work from there. Make sure it boots, first of all. Hopefully, it does. Then you can move on to what's described here, either DTBs or other modules. And I think one thing to mention, though, is that this is very much kind of a trial and error, not guaranteed path, right? We can't say for sure that it's going to work, but this is definitely the step that should be taken to see, because it's easier than our third option, which we're about to get to. But this is something that to try and see if you can get this option to work before you move on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another point to make, I guess, and we can, the other point to make about that is if you update something and it needs another update later, you're responsible for that. Then the maintenance falls to you. So
Yeah.
if a driver gets updated or a new device tree is shared by the manufacturer, if you're the one who's submitted the PR to get that added, then Balena's not going to be looking for those updates. Unless we already, again, happen to support something that would upstream affect you. But yeah, just to say that if you've added something custom and then it gets updated at some point, then you'll need to be keeping up with that and make sure that you update yours as well. And again, submit another PR or ask us to add it. But yes, so the hard option.
The harder option would be part 3, and we call that custom device support. And in keeping with the examples that I've shown, I showed the Raspberry Pi 4 for the first one, and the CM4 I/O board for the second. And for the third, we have this is called the Rev Pi, and this is also CM4 based. And of course, it doesn't look like the others, but inside it does have a carrier board. But this also has a lot of other added pieces, added modules, added functionality for more industrial applications. And this would be an example of custom device support. But in reality, it's really a hybrid, because we do actually support this out of the box. But in order to get there, it had to go through this process that we'll describe of custom device support.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons that you might do custom device support. One is that you've created truly custom hardware that just doesn't exist off the shelf anywhere. The other one, in this case, the Rev Pi, the Revolution Pi, is from a manufacturer that creates these specifically customized for manufacturing or for rough environments. They have all the features that you would need for very specific things, and that's their bread and butter. So you would want to work with someone like that who already does that, so you don't have to customize all those things yourself and start from ground zero. They've already got experience in it. But those manufacturers may want to make balenaOS compatible, or you may ask them to make balenaOS compatible. And we have ways for manufacturers to come to us and get trained up and start doing that work. So that's another reason that CDS may come into your life. But for their reference, we've kind of listed the baseline balenaOS compatibility requirements, and of course they can reach out to us and ask. But yeah, these are basically the points where you've tried doing the first two options. You've looked for compatible hardware and nothing meets your needs, or you've found something that does meet your needs. Let's say you've got some sort of Verisite SOM or something, but you've decided to make custom hardware work with it, and maybe the SOM is booting, but nothing else is working, or you're going to need a BSP added, and we know that or board support package BSP work is more complex than the little two examples we shared earlier. So you want somebody who's trained in Yocto and who's been trained in the specifics of our Balena BSP to do that work for you. And so that's when custom device support comes into play.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we should add that so it's not a self-serve process.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also to just clarify that Balena does not create or modify board support packages or BSPs, and we don't create or modify the custom device trees, but we have partners that might, and we'll be getting to that shortly.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Alan, is that these are uh, with these. Actually, can we go back to the last slide? Otherwise, I'm going to lose my train of thought. Thank you. With these, different options, one of the things that you need to remember is this isn't something simple. Again, there are people who've spent their whole lives doing Yocto work, and it's not easy. We make things look easy with Balena because we do all that hard work under the hood, and we make it invisible to most of our customers. But if you've gotten to the point where you want to make custom hardware available, it's not as simple. And so just to be clear, there are people who are experts in this. And we work with these integration partners in part because of the reasons that Alan said, where we don't do custom BSP work. We won't create a driver for you. But the folks that we've worked with and trained to become integration partners, those folks do. So if there's additional work you need done, or even application level work, a lot of them do that sort of work as well. I would be happy to work with you on that. But in the past, if you're used to working with Balena, you'll have found that we would do that work. And we've kind of gotten to the point where we have so many requests for new hardware that we just can't keep up. And we'd really like to spend our engineers' time on improving the operating system and improving the process of bringing new hardware to Balena. So we'd like them to not be working on individual custom boards when there are people who do that for a living. So that is why we're training integration partners, and also kind of why if you've been used to working with us in the past on the CDS project, that you'll start to be working with an integration partner. But yeah, that is what I wanted to say.
That's very good, and we'll have more information about the integration partners coming up shortly. But now that we've talked about that third option, that's a bit more involved, let's talk about when does that make sense? At what point would somebody need to start considering the CDS option?
Yeah. So it's usually not during the prototyping stage. So if any of this sounds worrisome, most people aren't doing this until they've kind of gotten to a point where they know their fleet is going to grow, it's going to grow significantly, and or there are just certain things that they require that they can't get from commercial off-the-shelf hardware. Um, so some of those, kind of like with the Revolution Pi, adding protections from harsh environments, the Rev Pi is, not just well, and adding functionality. So the Rev Pi has certain functionality specific to manufacturing processes that's really helpful and that you won't get off of a yeah, nice slide in. But it's specific to particular industries, and then it has protection from dust and water and other things that you might not get elsewhere. And then the other is really just about scale. So when you start to scale, you need supply chain guarantees. You need to make sure that when you hit your 200,000th device, that you're not going to suddenly run out of your product. And you're also going to start to benefit from economies of scale. So, it's great that you've got 100,000 devices, but you really, at that point, 10 cents matters. So you might want to remove anything that you don't need, and then save more money as you grow. And then, of course, the last one is just we find that a lot of manufacturers are um, wanting to bring balenaOS support to their hardware, and again, we've been a bottleneck for that because they've wanted to do it. And we've just said, we would love to do that, but there's only so many hours in a day. And so part of the work that we've been doing the last year is to enable hardware manufacturers to do that themselves. So folks like CompuLab can really just get it all done. And it's great to work with folks who want to do
Mhm.
that. So that's a process that a lot of manufacturers are open to if you just chat with them. So yeah.
And you would say that your Balena account manager is your guide through this process,
Oh yeah,
basically. Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the process and pricing and things like that. But just to be clear, your customer success or account manager is the right person to talk to. They'll walk you through the whole process, and if you have questions, they can help answer them. That sort of thing. So in this slide, the CDS process, I'm just going to share it a little bit with you, but in this second step, it says contact us. I'm linking to a form, but that's to say that if you haven't already gotten in touch with us, if you have already gotten in touch with us, then you already know who your customer success person is and you can just chat with them. But yeah, so we have a form to fill out for custom device support. And this form is going to ask you, basic things, company name, and your what hardware it is, links to it, asking if it has a Yocto BSP, and if so, where the link to that is from the manufacturer, any peripherals you want to use, what kernel you're expecting to be running, all of those sorts of technical details. But the other thing that we want to know is your timeline. Because when we get to the point where we're talking to integrators to find the right person to work with you on the project, a lot of the one of the important pieces will be to know if they have time. If they're booked up for the next
Mhm.
2 months and you plan to deploy your product in a month, that's going to be a problem. So we need to know. And I will say this does take some time. So just be aware this is a process to be considering as early as you can, even though obviously you may not scale super quickly, but just be aware that this isn't like a 5-day process. This is several months in the making. So after you submit that form, you've let your customer success representative know, hey, I've submitted the form. This is the timeline we're looking for. Then we'll review it with an integration partner and say, hey, is this something that you're interested in doing within the timeline that we have available? And a lot of partners are familiar with specific things. So we know some partners are really good at working with Verisite or have a lot of capability with the NVIDIA Jetson products or that sort of thing. So we can kind of point you to somebody who will be the best fit for your project. And then, make sure that we're within their timeline. And once we find somebody and we've introduced you to them, then there's a process where we need you to send your hardware to us, and then we'll get it to both us, our internal site, and then to a partner. That process takes about 2 weeks. And then once the hardware has been received by us and the partner will start the review process. And this takes about a week. So the idea is that they'll go through the basics of making sure that the device boots with the manufacturer's BSP and that everything that should work is working. And this is all before balenaOS. So just making sure that everything works as expected, because surprisingly, that is not the case a lot of times when people send us hardware. So this takes some time. And then the other piece is we have something we call AutoKit. I'll get into that in a little bit, but it's part of our CI/CD pipeline. So before an update goes out to Balena Cloud, the hardware actually has to be passing certain tests. And so we want to make sure that the hardware can work with AutoKit. And so all of that work needs to be done. And so that'll take about a week. And then from there, the partner will be able to give you a quote that says, for the rest of the work that we need to do based on what we've seen this past week, this is the quote for the rest of that work. And if you agree, then they'll start the process of enabling the hardware for balenaOS. And they have a direct link with us so that if they have any questions, they can reach out and we can help them with GitHub repos and any bug fixes that need to happen or questions they have. So that's the process in a nutshell.
Mhm. Yeah, those are great points. And as we said at the beginning of the slide, your customer success account manager is your guide through the process. Now, for folks that may be contemplating this, I'm sure there's a question about the cost. So on the next slide, I believe we have some information about that. Ken, if you can kind of give us an idea of what to expect.
Yep. So the initial investigation that I mentioned is that first week, and I kind of mentioned AutoKit. I guess there is a link to the longer description of what we do, but the idea is that we want to make sure everything's as tested as possible before it goes to production. And so we have this hardware rig, and there is the blog link. But we have this hardware rig that we put all of the hardware in, and it does things like rebooting a device and allowing us to test Ethernet and basic capabilities. And so every time we release a rolling balenaOS release, it'll test it with that hardware. Or if you've asked us for an ESR version, then it'll test it with that hardware. And so we want to make sure that the hardware works with that. So for instance, we've run into some crazy situations where maybe the hardware was never meant to be turned off. And so it didn't work with AutoKit right out of the box. And that was something we had to work with the manufacturer on. And that was something that, again, if someone's estimating the amount of time it's going to take them to finish the work for you, they want to add that in and let you know that some of the delays may be on the manufacturer's side, and then it's going to take some work for us to get that integrated. So that investigation typically, like I said, takes about a week. So 40 hours if you're assuming a 5-day work week at 8 hours a day. And that's chargeable engineering work. So you'll expect to pay whatever their hourly charges for their engineers for about 40 hours. At that point, they have the better estimate. They'll share that with you. And I would just say from our experience having worked with these integrators and a lot of the projects that we do, you probably shouldn't expect to pay less than $10,000. Sometimes the case is that it'll be a little less, but it's not by much. The lowest I think I've seen is $7,000 to $8,000. So just to say this is, them charging for their time and materials. And the more complex your hardware is, or the more complex the situation is, maybe if there's not drivers, if the BSP doesn't already work, that sort of thing, the more time it's going to take them. So any of that kind of work that needs to be done is just going to be added in there, but it'll be clearly stated and you can decide if that's what you want to do. I mean, at that point, you may decide that that's a cost that you don't want to incur at this time. And you could
Mhm.
choose to go back to something that's more off the shelf and maybe doesn't have everything you need, but then you know what the cost is so that in the future, when that cost does make sense, you know exactly who to work with and what you need to get that done. So that's kind of the short version of costs. And I hate to say it as so broadly. In the past, we've kind of done a fixed fee, but that was just because it was our internal engineers doing it, and we knew that they could do things really quickly for the most part, and so we just kind of had a flat fee. But with moving over to integrators, the industry standard is to charge for time and materials, and those folks deserve to get paid for their work. So just to give people a updated expectation that most of that work is not less than $10,000, which is about 50 hours estimated. If you're assuming an engineer's time is $200 an hour, and that's kind of at the high end, but just baseline setting, that's pretty reasonable.
Yeah, and talking about whether the cost of CDS makes sense, is there's also an ongoing cost to consider as well, right? A monthly cost as well.
Yeah, so if you're doing custom device support, yeah, I guess I didn't think to put that in the slide. That's a really, really good point. So we charge a monthly maintenance fee, and so this is for us to continually test in AutoKit those releases, and when something fails, to work through the bug fixes and all of that, and maybe update upstream Balena or fix something in conjunction with the manufacturer. So that's typically a $2,000 a month fee. If again, that's for your custom device hardware. If it's something that ends up being something that anybody could use, let's say, for instance, the Revolution Pi is a perfect example. The Revolution Pi was something we didn't support before, but it's not fully, it's something that you could buy off the shelf anytime. And so we wouldn't necessarily charge you the $2,000 a month for that, because we have enough other customers that would be taking advantage of that board. But when it's a custom board that's only related to you, and it's going to take extra work from our engineers, then we do charge for their time each month. And again, it's not terribly a lot of time, but it's something just to make sure that we're getting that work done, and also that the time is being accounted for.
That's very good. Yes. And I think one of the questions, and if we go to the next slide, we can answer this question, is can anyone do CDS for themselves, or does it have to go through a Balena partner? And here are our partners.
Yeah, so these are all the integration partners that we've been working with. They're great folks. We've been training them over the past year to get learning about balenaOS kind of inside and out. Some people know how to do an application here or there with Balena, but actually getting through the Meta Balena Yocto layers and really understanding how our operating system works is an extra piece of, of work that people have to do. So we've trained these folks, and they're great. They're great people to work with. But yeah, we don't recommend people do it yourself. We have had a lot of people do that in the past, and that's kind of why another reason that we've moved to the integrator route is that what we find is people will put 100, 150 hours into trying to learn Yocto or learn Meta Balena specific stuff. And the amount of time that they've lost from an engineering perspective is just so much greater than it would have been for them to have an integrator do the work for them, that we're just not recommending it anymore. The other piece is, as we kind of mentioned, the long-term support for it. What we don't want to see any further is a device type being neglected from an updates perspective, especially with security concerns as high as they are these days. It's not right for them not to be getting updates. That's just not the right path. So you'll start to see us slowly removing any devices that aren't getting maintained long term. And so you should only be seeing updated and maintained device types on our platform from the standard dropdown. And then in the case that you are paying the monthly fee to get updates, we're going to be updating those regularly for you. And again, testing if something breaks. So yeah, the idea is to make sure that things are maintained, that as much as possible, we're keeping up with the latest kernel updates and security patches and all those sorts of things. But yeah, that results in some long-term work, maintenance work, that a lot of people, if you're focused on your application, you're just not going to be thinking about it. And that's how you get into some trouble with either your latest update bricking or not working or whatever, or just missing a security patch that would have been really beneficial. So we're trying to make sure that this is a first-class experience all the way around. So we just if you're interested in DIY because you have Yocto experience, we're willing to talk to you. but probably will ask you to go to an integrator. It's I'd say 9 times out of 10 we'll ask you to go through an integrator.
Great. Well, I think that is basically our CDS and hardware selection in a nutshell, a 45-minute nutshell. And I'm sure that has generated some questions. And we do know that some of our attendees have submitted questions ahead of time. So why don't we start with, I think we have time, excuse me, why don't we start with that first? And then we'll get into any questions that have been submitted since the webinar has begun. So if we move on to the next slide, this is a multi-part, very in-depth question that was submitted by one of our attendees. And I'll just start, I'll read a couple of these, Kenna, if you want to address them. But first point is, do we have to handle the Yocto/host OS development, or does Balena handle it for a particular board? And I'll also add, what do we do if we want to keep the host OS version private? I think you've touched on the first one, so I'll combine those
Not
two.
the second. Yeah. So I mean, again, we actually prefer people not to handle the Yocto pieces themselves. It really is something that it's kind of like any home improvement project. Sometimes it's best to leave it to the professionals. And so in that case, we've kind of found that to be true for adding balenaOS support. So we'd like to do that. But you can keep the OS version private. So a lot of times people have intellectual property built into their Yocto BSP or the hardware, and so it's important for them to keep their repo private. And we're happy to do that for folks. There is, some situations where the device type just won't show up in the Balena Cloud dashboard because it doesn't make sense for anybody else to be using that device. It's custom specific to a particular customer, but they're so all of our Yocto and BSP work is on a public GitHub repo. So it may not be in the dashboard, but that doesn't mean that the IP would be private. So in the case that you don't want anyone to see it in the dashboard except for specific orgs, and you also don't want your GitHub repo to be shared, then we can keep that private. And I think that jumps into the third question too, what costs are there if we wanted to make that work private. So if you decide to keep your GitHub repo private as well, then we charge a $200 a month fee for that. But everything else is fine. The part of the reason for that cost is that it takes a little bit of extra from us on the back end to make things work. We have our private set of device types and our public ones. So so there's just a little bit of upkeep and maintenance costs that we charge for.
Great. I think there's just a few more parts to this question. And the first one is about whether there's a way to roll back to an older OS version with custom device support. I know there isn't with standard balenaOS, so they're wondering if that option is available with the custom one.
Yeah, so the answer in that one is no. Basically, the process we go through for custom device support is the exact same process we do to enable any hardware on Balena. So there's no difference in the capabilities from the OS that you'll see compared to one of the standard devices that we have in our compatibility list. The point of Balena really is to make sure that the feature set is the same across any hardware that you would use. So that's true for custom hardware as well.
And the final bullet point for this question is about testing tools or CI/CD workflows for companies that do want to implement custom board support.
Yeah, so whether you end up having a manufacturer do this work or an integrator, or if you do have the capabilities in-house, we have the AutoKit tool or rig. And the nice thing about that is we've open sourced it, so you can create that yourself. You can run tests on your own hardware. And the other nice thing is you can actually add your own testing suites or tests that you want to run. So, we test for very basic things that are going to be true across basically any hardware platform. There may be something specific, maybe a particular modem that you want to test certain things for, or again, maybe you've added the real-time clock and you want to test for certain scenarios. You can add that because everything is open source. It's not simple, I won't say that. It's again, this is part of what we've trained our integration partners on, and what we train manufacturers on is to go through this process. And I would say about 70% of bringing balenaOS compatibility to hardware is the actual Yocto BSPs and getting the drivers working, that sort of stuff. But the other 30% is making sure it works in our CI/CD workflow through AutoKit. So it's not a small amount of work that you would be doing, but again, the benefit is huge. That for the next 5-10 years, however long you keep that hardware out there, you're going to be able to test automatically new OS releases that come out. And that's just fantastic. It's a really valuable thing, and it helps us scale and it helps you scale.
And I believe we have a blog post about AutoKit for anybody that wants to learn more about it, and we can include that link. Oh, there it is. Magically appears.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So definitely, if you're interested in learning more about that, check out the article about the AutoKit.
Yeah.
So I believe that covers the questions that have been submitted ahead of time, but I'm just looking through the chat now, and I do see a couple of other questions we can try to address. It looks like we have a little bit of time. What is balenaOS and where can we download it? How can we use it similar to Windows OS and laptops? Well, it is an OS in the sense that Windows is also an OS, but there's some pretty big differences, and you could use it on a laptop, but that's probably not how most people will use it. But to answer the question specifically, we did talk in the beginning about what balenaOS is, and you can download it from our website. And Ken, I'll let you address this as well. But I just wanted to say that balenaOS is typically deployed in embedded and edge devices. So while you could run it on a laptop, it wouldn't be a similar experience to Windows. It doesn't have a graphical user interface, and you wouldn't really be able to use it in the same way. And Ken, I'll let you address some more of the differences of how somebody would find and use balenaOS. It's a good basic question.
Yeah. I mean, so if you go to balena.io/OS, you would be able to download the operating system. But as Alan said, there's no graphical user interface. So when you first boot it, you're not really going to see anything. And so the point of Balena is to be application specific. So you develop your application in containers, and then you want to deploy it to an edge device. It can be a laptop. And in fact, we also have folks who deploy to servers. Again, they have some specific application that they want to run on server hardware. It's perfectly possible. But you wouldn't necessarily want to use balenaOS, for instance, to replace Windows in a library. If you have users that want to use Word and they want to use their email, Balena is probably not the right fit. But if you're looking to do something application specific with those laptops, so maybe it's a check-in for people who are coming in and you want to do some facial recognition and make sure they are who they are and the registration is done and completed, then you can absolutely do that on a normal laptop with a generic x86 device type. So it's really about your application. If it makes sense, then yeah, you can definitely download and install it. But again, just to say that if you install just the operating system and boot that up, you're going to be a little surprised that there's nothing there until you add the application.
Mainly for running containers on the edge. You could run it on a laptop. If you download it the way Kenneth said, it would be unprovisioned at that point. You could still use it, but you would also have a good experience if you sign up for Balena Cloud and download it that way. And then you would have a provisioned one that you could at least control from the Balena Cloud dashboard. And you absolutely could add a GUI if that's what you really wanted to. That was a good example, Kenneth, for a laptop. If you had like a sign-in at an event, you could create a container that has a GUI and accesses the screen But that is just one way that you can use it. So hopefully that gives you an answer to your question, and you could check out Balena Cloud and balena.io and try it out for yourself. And
we had 2 people say hello to us, and we didn't say good morning to them. So I want to say
yes,
hi to Mike Taylor and to Madeline Brown.
yeah,
I'm
hello
also in
to
Washington.
Yeah, Ken is also nearby. I see another question here, just mentioning the Pi Camera Module 3. I just addressed that briefly. We have had a forum thread about the Camera Module 3. I personally have had it running on balenaOS, so I know that it is possible to run it on a Pi. I believe I had it on a Pi 3 or Pi 4. And that forum thread, I did put my experience in on how I got it running. And definitely using a newer version of balenaOS helps, a very recent version. I think if we can find that link to that forum thread, we'll also include that in the follow-up. I don't have it right at hand, but it is available in our forums to get more information about using that module. And it does work, as I've said. Not sure about every particular situation and every particular type of container, but I do at least have an example where it was working for me. So we'll try to get you that information after the webinar. And I'm just checking to see, it looks like we've answered all the questions. I think we're nearing the end. We'll give just a moment for folks to add any more questions. And welcome to Charles, who just
Is there
arrived.
a list of the RevPi supported hardware? Yay!
Yeah, very good question, Ken. That would be on the list that you have provided, right?
Yeah, so we have, you may not see it in the chat, Dirk, there should be a, it's docs.balena.io/reference/hardware/devices. We'll link it. You don't need to remember all that, but that list has all of the supported devices that we have, and that includes the RevPi hardware. The newest one that we've added is the one that Alan was showing, the RevPi Connect 4. But we know that we want to work with Revolution Pi to get more of their hardware added. So if you have any particular hardware you're interested in, please let us know, because we may prioritize that in the list of things we want to support. But yeah, we like working with them. They're good folks. So if you have anything you're interested in, let us know. And I will say, while we're waiting on folks, that there's just, I think I said it at the beginning, but there's just kind of a hodgepodge of information about what's supported and how to support things and all that stuff. And we are rethinking all of that and how to better display that on our website. So part of the reason that I wanted to do a blog post about all of the things we talk about in here after this webinar is to put all those things that are really in separate places today all in one place so you can find it, but also so that once we do update the website and everything's a lot more clear, we can update those links with the more obvious places to find it. And hopefully you won't need a webinar to find out those things. You'll be able to just read through and get your questions answered for the most part. But yeah, we just wanted to really share some updates since we're adding integration partners and we're trying to move folks away from doing the DIY process. So I just wanted to say thanks for watching all of this. It's been a lot of work from our side, but it's all for good things. I think we're all going to grow a lot faster doing it this way. So I appreciate you guys being patient with our docs in the meantime.
Well, yeah, thank you, Kenna, for answering all of those questions and providing all that information. As you mentioned, we'll have the blog post and the follow-up. I guess you're saying the blog post will kind of be a stopgap while we get the rest of the materials organized. So we'll have that blog post in the meantime where everything will be in one place. So I think that is pretty much it. If you have any further questions, please do get in touch with us. I think that would be hello@balena.io. Is that our contact inbox? Yep. So please do get in touch if you have further questions. And I want to once again thank Kenna for joining us and answering these questions. And thank you to Mark, our producer, for helping behind the scenes. And just also please stay tuned for our next webinar. We try to have these at regular intervals. So please stay tuned, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. And thank you, Alan.